Tonight we drift into a myth of feathers, fate, and the wildly inappropriate hobbies of the Greek gods. Prepare to slip into a story older than empires, one that begins not with a storm, but with a swan. Not a normal swan, of course, not the kind that hisses at tourists or glides peacefully across village ponds. No, this swan was radiant, almost too radiant, golden in the right light, graceful in the wrong way. The kind of bird you notice, not just for its beauty, but because it seems just a little too smug. This, as it turns out, is not just any bird, it's Zeus. Why, you ask? Well, that's the question, isn't it? Before we begin, please comment where you are and what time it is so we can see who's joining us from around the world. It's fascinating to discover where you are tuning in from. Now close your eyes, sink into the covers, take a deep breath and release it, relaxing your face, shoulders and the rest of your body. Let your thoughts slow, and let this very old tale carry you gently into slumber. Picture, if you will, ancient Sparta in high summer. Not the austere military state it would later become, but a land of rolling hills thick with olive groves and wildflowers, where bees drunk on thyme-scented air bumble lazily between blooms. The Eurotas River wound through the valley like a silver ribbon dropped by a careless goddess, its waters singing secrets over smooth-worn stones. The air here held layers of scent, wild oregano crushed underfoot, sun-warmed cypress, the sweet decay of fallen olives fermenting in the grass. Birds called to each other in the twisted branches of ancient trees, the low coo of doves, the chattering of sparrows, the occasional cry of an eagle wheeling high above. These were normal birds, doing normal bird things. Remember them. They'll make our next visitor all the more conspicuous. In the palace gardens, fountains whispered their endless conversations with the wind. Servants moved like shadows through columned corridors, their sandalled feet whispering against sun-warmed marble. The day was drowsy with heat, the kind of afternoon where even the cicadas seemed to sing in slow motion, where time itself moved like honey dripping from a tilted jar. And then, then came the swan. But before we meet our feathered friend, let's be clear about what we're dealing with. This was no ordinary swan. If you've ever encountered a regular swan, you know they're already operating on a surplus of dignity. They glide around like they're perpetually judging your life choices, neck swivelling at you with the disdain of 1,000 disappointed aristocrats. This swan, however, took it to an entirely new level. Its feathers didn't just gleam, they radiated, catching light that hadn't even existed until it needed catching. Each movement was choreographed perfection, as if it had spent centuries practicing how to swan more magnificently than any swan had ever swanned before. Its neck curved in a way that made mathematical principles feel inadequate. Even the air around it seemed embarrassed by its own plainness in comparison. Because this, you see, was Zeus. Yes, that Zeus. King of Olympus, hurler of thunderbolts, serial shapeshifter, and apparently now competing in the all-divinity Beautiful Bird Championship. The same god who could level mountains with a nod was currently adjusting his tail feathers and practicing his best wounded innocent expression. Why, you might ask, would the king of the gods choose to become a swan? The answer, as it so often does in Greek mythology, involves a woman. But not just any woman. This was Leda, queen of Sparta, and she was about to have a very unusual afternoon. Let us properly meet Leda, shall we? Queen of Sparta, wife of Tyndareus, and currently walking alone by the riverbank, blissfully unaware that she's about to become a pivotal character in one of mythology's more awkward episodes. Leda moved with a kind of grace that makes sculptors weep into their marble. Her peplos, a deep blue like twilight caught in fabric, whispered against the grass as she walked. She had the sort of beauty that poets would later struggle to capture, though not for lack of trying. It wasn't just her features, though those were striking enough. It was the way she carried herself. as if dignity wasn't something she wore but something she exhaled. The afternoon had drawn her to the river's edge, away from the stuffiness of palace politics and the endless parade of courtiers seeking favours. Here, among the nodding reeds and drowsy dragonflies, she could simply be. Her sandalled feet left delicate prints in the damp sand as she walked, each step measured and thoughtful. The river chattered its endless stories beside her, while damselflies sparked like living sapphires above the water. She was thinking, as queens often must, about matters of state, about her husband Tyndareus, who was everything a king should be, noble, just, and completely unsuspecting that his wife was about to have an encounter with a deity in disguise, about the latest diplomatic tensions with Athens, about the upcoming festival of Apollo, about all the 1,000 threads that needed tending in the tapestry of ruling. The air smelled of watermint and sun-warmed stone. A few strands of her dark hair had escaped their careful arrangement, dancing in the breeze like snippets of night made visible. Everything was peaceful, normal, ordinary. Then came the sound of wings. Not the gentle flutter of riverside birds. No, this was different. A rushing, urgent sound that seemed to push the very air aside. It grew louder, closer, more insistent. The kind of wing beats that suggest something large and divine is about to make a very dramatic entrance. Leda looked up, shielding her eyes against the sun, and there was the swan staged against the sky like a living constellation. Its wings spread wide enough to catch small clouds, its neck curved in a way that would have made geometry teachers reach for their protractors. The sun caught each feather individually, as if Zeus had actually spent time considering the optimal angle for dramatic lighting. Now here's where Zeus's plan got creative. Instead of simply landing gracefully, which, let's be honest, would have been impressive enough, he decided to go for theatrical gold. The magnificent swan suddenly appeared to falter in its flight. Its wings stuttered. It began to fall. Not a graceless plummet, mind you. This was a choreographed descent, each tumble calculated to appear both alarming and aesthetically pleasing. A pursuing eagle, which several witnesses later swore looked suspiciously like it was made of clouds, conveniently appeared and disappeared in the background, providing a reasonable explanation for the swan's distress. Leda, being both compassionate and unfortunately positioned, did exactly what Zeus had hoped. She reached out to catch the falling bird. The impact was surprisingly gentle for a diving deity. The swan landed in her arms with all the weight of destiny, and none of the bruising one might expect from catching a celestial waterfowl. It trembled against her chest, its heart beating with a rhythm too complex for mere bird anatomy. A few drops of golden ichor, carefully applied earlier behind a cloud, glistened on its wing. The swan looked up at her with eyes that were decidedly unswan-like, eyes that held galaxies in their depths, that sparked with ancient knowledge and very recent cunning. Its feathers were warm against her skin, not the warmth of ordinary flesh and blood, but the kind of heat you might feel from standing too close to a star. The moment hung suspended between heartbeats, between the tick and tock of time itself. The river seemed to slow its course, and even the ever-chattering birds fell silent, as if nature itself was holding its breath to watch what would happen next. Leda's fingers, those elegant royal fingers that had never known common labour, moved instinctively to check the swan's wound, but everywhere she touched she found only warm, impossibly soft feathers that seemed to lean into her touch, like cats seeking attention. The supposed injury kept mysteriously shifting locations, always just beyond where she was currently looking. A divine game of now you see it, now you don't, that she was still too concerned to notice was odd. The swan, meanwhile, was giving the performance of several lifetimes. It managed to simultaneously appear helpless, while also preening magnificently, each tremble carefully calculated, each soft sound precisely calibrated to inspire sympathy. If Olympic medals had existed for method acting while in bird form, Zeus would have swept the competition. When it pressed its head against her neck, the gesture was almost courtly, for a swan. Its feathers carried impossible scents, mountain air from Olympus, ambrosia, thunderstorms brewing over distant seas. Not that Leda noticed these divine giveaways. She was too busy trying to comfort what she thought was an injured bird, unaware that she was essentially petting the king of the gods. The sun continued its slow arc across the sky, casting long shadows that stretched like cats across the riverbank. The light caught the swan's feathers in ways that defied both physics and good taste, creating miniature rainbows that danced across Leda's skin. If anyone had been watching, and several nymphs absolutely were, though they had the good sense to look embarrassed about it, they might have noticed how the swan's eyes kept changing colour, shifting between storm cloud grey and electric blue. Leda spoke softly to her feathered patient, murmuring the sort of gentle nonsense one uses to calm injured creatures. Each word seemed to make the air shimmer slightly, as reality tried to adjust to the fact that a mortal was accidentally sweet-talking the ruler of Olympus. The swan responded with soft sounds that were definitely not standard swan vocabulary, managing to suggest both gratitude and something else entirely. As she cradled the bird, trying to decide whether to take it back to the palace, which was exactly what Zeus had hoped she'd consider, she failed to notice several rather obvious signs that this was no ordinary swan. The way small flowers spontaneously bloomed wherever its feet touched the ground. How the clouds overhead had arranged themselves into suspiciously artistic patterns. The fact that several nearby trees had suddenly developed better posture, standing straighter in the presence of their divine ruler, even if he was currently covered in feathers. The air grew thick with unspoken possibilities. Even the river seemed to be moving more slowly, its waters creating elaborate swirling patterns, as if trying to spell out a warning that Leda unfortunately couldn't read. As the afternoon light turned to honey gold, Leda made what seemed at the time to be a perfectly reasonable decision. She would take the injured swan back to the palace. After all, what could possibly go wrong with bringing an unusually attractive waterfowl into one's home? Surely this wouldn't become the sort of tale that would keep poets employed for millennia. The walk back to the palace was a masterclass in divine method acting. Zeus managed to be just injured enough to require carrying, yet somehow still able to strike elegant poses against the setting sun. Every few steps he would let out a soft, musical sound that was less injured swan and more accomplished tenor practicing scales. The local wildlife, recognising their divine ruler even in feathered form, created what can only be described as an impromptu honour guard, though Leda, bless her, simply thought it odd that so many animals were standing at attention. The palace gardens received them with a sudden burst of blooming flowers that definitely weren't in season. Fountains spontaneously adjusted their spray patterns to create more romantic atmospherics. Even the marble columns seemed to stand a little straighter, though that might have been a trick of the light, or possibly architectural anxiety in the presence of divinity. Leda's private chambers were a study in refined elegance, all flowing draperies and tasteful frescoes, though the swan somehow managed to look more expensive than all of it combined. She settled her feathered patient on a couch that probably cost more than most people's houses, yet suddenly seemed inadequate for its divine occupant. As she went to fetch water and soft cloths to tend the mysterious wound that kept relocating itself, the swan took the opportunity to do some rapid redecorating. The light in the room adjusted itself to the most flattering angles, the air filled with subtle fragrances, mountain thyme, ambrosia, and just a hint of ozone, like the air before a storm. A few strategic rose petals materialized out of nowhere and arranged themselves artistically on the floor. When Leda returned, she found her patient had somehow managed to position himself in what can only be described as the swan equivalent of a classical sculpture pose. The last rays of sunlight caught his feathers in a way that would have made master painters weep with inadequacy. He had also somehow acquired a faint golden glow that any reasonable person might have found suspicious. But Leda, focused on her self-appointed nursing duties, failed to notice that her patient was less interested in medical attention and more concerned with artistic lighting. As she leaned in to examine the supposedly injured wing, the air grew thick with divine presence. The room's temperature rose slightly. Outside, clouds began gathering in patterns that, if viewed from above, might have spelled out Zeus was here in ancient Greek. The moment stretched like honey dripping from a spoon. Even the usually chatty palace sparrows had fallen silent, perhaps out of respect, perhaps out of embarrassment, or possibly because their divine ruler had given them a meaningful look that suggested silence would be wise. The pivotal moment arrived with all the subtlety of a thunderbolt at a meditation retreat. As Leda's fingers brushed through impossibly soft feathers searching for that ever-elusive injury, the air in the chamber began to crystallize with divine energy. Static electricity danced along the walls. The marble floor developed interesting new patterns that suspiciously resembled tiny lightning bolts. The swan chose this moment to reveal his true nature, though chose might be generous, as several of the more gossipy palace servants later swore they heard muffled thunder laughing. The transformation wasn't so much a sudden change as it was reality politely stepping aside to let divinity take centre stage. The golden glow that had been merely suspicious before now became obvious enough to require explanations. Feathers began to shimmer like starlight on water, each one containing its own private constellation. The air filled with the scent of thunder and mountain winds, with just a hint of that distinctive aroma that suggests someone's been rearranging the fabric of reality. Leda, to her credit, realised something was amiss when her patient's eyes began cycling through various weather conditions. It's one thing to tend to an injured swan. It's quite another when said swan's gaze contains actual storm fronts. The moment of recognition crossed her face like a slow-moving cloud shadow. First confusion, then disbelief, followed by the particular expression reserved for mortals who suddenly realise they're in the presence of a deity with questionable intentions. Zeus, having apparently decided that subtlety had served its purpose, and perhaps never been his strong suit anyway, allowed his divine radiance to leak through his feathered disguise. The effect was less like a gentle revelation, and more like someone had installed a celestial spotlight in the chamber. Several nearby tapestries spontaneously developed more artistic compositions, and at least one vase decided to upgrade its decorative patterns. The air in the chamber grew thick with possibility and divine presence. Outside, the gathering storm clouds had arranged themselves into what looked suspiciously like a celestial audience, complete with premium seating arrangements. A distant roll of thunder sounded remarkably like someone clearing their throat dramatically. Leda, who had been raised on stories of divine visitations but had probably never expected to star in one, found herself in that peculiar position familiar to many mythological figures, caught between awe, terror, and the dawning realization that she was about to become a very important footnote in supernatural history. The swan, who was now less a swan and more a suggestion of swanness wrapped around raw divinity, managed to look both magnificent and somehow apologetic, if it's possible for a bird to convey complex emotional states while glowing like a supernova in feather form. What happened next has been the subject of countless artistic interpretations, most of them featuring strategically placed drapery and convenient clouds. The actual moment was less about aesthetic composition and more about the fundamental awkwardness of reality adjusting itself around divine whims. The chamber filled with a light that somehow managed to be both blinding and tactful. The air hummed with power, each molecule vibrating like tiny tuning forks touched by divine electricity. Time itself grew confused, stretching and compressing like a cosmic accordion being played by an enthusiastic amateur. Outside, the weather was having what could only be described as a theatrical crisis. Clouds performed elaborate choreography, thunder provided dramatic soundtrack, and random flowers burst into bloom despite it being entirely the wrong season. Several statues in the garden suddenly developed better postures, and at least one fountain began producing what appeared to be sparkling wine instead of water. Meanwhile, in the palace proper, servants found themselves inexplicably needed elsewhere. Guards discovered urgent matters requiring their attention on the opposite side of the building. Even the usually bold palace cats made themselves scarce, though one particularly stubborn tabby stayed just long enough to give Zeus a look that suggested it was distinctly unimpressed with divine transformation techniques. The actual encounter between god and mortal was mercifully veiled by sheets of golden light and conveniently placed mist, though several nymphs who definitely weren't watching swore later that they heard snatches of conversation ranging from formal introductions to what sounded suspiciously like Zeus attempting to explain himself while still partially in swan form. Leda, for her part, found herself in the unique position of simultaneously experiencing terror, awe, and the sort of exasperation usually reserved for dealing with particularly dramatic royalty. The stories don't mention whether she pointed out the absurdity of his chosen approach, but given what we know of Spartan directness, it seems likely that some frank words were exchanged about the propriety of gods pretending to be injured waterfowl. Time continued its uneven dance around the chamber. Minutes stretched into hours, or possibly compressed into seconds. Chronology tends to get confused when dealing with divine encounters. The air sparkled with tiny motes of golden light that would later inspire particularly ambitious jewellery makers. And somewhere, high on Mount Olympus, several other gods were definitely not watching these events unfold while making pointed comments about Zeus's theatrical tendencies. Though Aphrodite might have been taking notes, Athena was almost certainly shaking her head, and Hera, well, Hera was probably adding another tally to her ongoing list of reasons to be righteously annoyed with her husband. As the divine radiance finally began to fade, rather like a celestial dimmer switch being turned down by a considerate stage manager, the chamber was left in a state that could only be described as supernaturally dishevelled. The air still sparkled with residual divinity, like someone had spilled a jar of cosmic glitter. Several pieces of furniture had spontaneously upgraded themselves to solid gold, and the floor mosaic had rearranged itself into a significantly more artistic pattern. Zeus, having apparently remembered his godly dignity, and possibly noting the lateness of the hour, prepared for his dramatic exit. The transformation back to full swan form was considerably more graceful than strictly necessary, accompanied by what seemed to be its own divine light show. Even the air appeared to bow as he moved toward the window, managing to look both regal and vaguely apologetic. Quite a feat for a bird, even a divine one. Before departing, he cast one last meaningful look at Leda, the kind of look that suggests, we really should discuss this sometime, but also, please, don't mention this to my wife. The thunder outside, which had been providing ongoing commentary throughout the encounter, now offered what could only be interpreted as a theatrical flourish. As Zeus took to the sky, the clouds parted in a suspiciously coordinated manner, creating what looked remarkably like a celestial spotlight. Several rainbows appeared, despite there being no rain, and a flock of doves materialized to provide an honor guard, though they seemed slightly confused about why they were there. Leda was left standing in her chamber trying to process exactly what had just happened. The room still hummed with fading divine energy, and several objects continued to randomly turn into gold whenever she glanced at them. Her hair, which had been perfectly arranged that morning, now looked like it had been styled by a lovesick lightning bolt. The palace slowly began to return to normal, or at least as normal as possible after an impromptu divine visitation. Servants cautiously returned to their duties, though they gave Leda's chamber a wide berth, possibly due to the faint smell of ozone and ambrosia that lingered in the vicinity. The fountain in the garden reluctantly went back to producing regular water instead of wine, though it did so with a distinct air of disappointment. But there was something else, something that wouldn't become apparent for several days, a feeling, a certainty, a divine consequence taking root. Because when gods visit mortals, they rarely leave without leaving something behind, and in this case, that something would turn out to be rather more significant than usual. The next few weeks in Sparta were marked by what court historians would delicately refer to as interesting meteorological phenomena. The sky couldn't seem to decide whether to celebrate or apologise. One moment producing perfect sunny days with suspiciously heart-shaped clouds, the next offering dramatic thunderstorms that seemed to be showing off. Local weather workers quietly updated their resumes and considered career changes. Leda, meanwhile, began experiencing the sort of symptoms that usually indicate either divine intervention or an extremely creative storyteller at work. The palace gardens bloomed out of season whenever she walked through them. Her dreams were filled with feathers and starlight, and most notably she developed some rather unusual cravings, specifically for foods that shouldn't exist, like golden apples and ambrosia-flavoured olives. Then came the morning when she discovered the eggs. Yes, eggs. Plural. Because apparently when Zeus decides to complicate someone's life, he doesn't do it halfway. They appeared in her chamber at dawn, nestled in what appeared to be a bed of cloud stuff and moonbeams. The eggs themselves defied several laws of physics and most principles of biology. They gleamed like polished marble but felt warm to the touch, and if you looked at them from the right angle, you could see tiny constellations moving beneath their shells. The palace staff, to their credit, handled this development with remarkable professionalism, though several handmaidens did have to take brief breaks to question their entire understanding of reproductive biology. The royal physician was summoned, took one look at the eggs, muttered something about above my pay grade, and prescribed bed rest and regular offerings to all applicable deities. King Tyndareus, who had been away on a conveniently timed diplomatic mission, returned to find his wife tending to a pair of divine eggs that occasionally hummed in harmony with distant thunder. Historical records are unclear about his exact reaction, but several sources suggest he took it rather well for a man whose family situation had suddenly become considerably more mythological. The eggs required special care, of course. They needed to be kept at precisely the temperature of a summer afternoon on Mount Olympus. They had to be turned every hour by hands wearing silk gloves woven by moonlight. And they absolutely refused to sit still when someone tried to sketch them for the royal records, leading to some rather abstract official documentation. Local priests were consulted, though most of them just nodded wisely and suggested making generous offerings to all potentially involved deities. Several seers went into early retirement rather than attempt to prophesy about this particular situation, and at least one oracle reportedly took one look into the future, said, "Oh my," and decided to take a long vacation. As the eggs grew larger and occasionally levitated during thunderstorms, speculation ran wild throughout Sparta. Court poets struggled to find words that rhymed with divine waterfowl visitation, while maintaining appropriate dignity. Sculptors debated the proper artistic representation of such an unusual family situation, and somewhere on Olympus, other gods were definitely not taking bets on what would eventually hatch. The hatching began, as many mythologically significant events do, at midnight during a particularly theatrical thunderstorm. The eggs, which had spent the previous days emitting a soft golden glow and occasionally humming what sounded suspiciously like celestial harmonies, decided it was time to make their grand entrance into the world. The first crack appeared in the left egg just as a perfectly timed lightning bolt illuminated the chamber. It wasn't the sort of mundane crack you'd see in ordinary eggs. No, this was a fracture line that sparkled like crushed diamonds and seemed to trace constellations across the shell. The air in the chamber grew thick with anticipation and what smelled remarkably like divine baby powder. The right egg, apparently not to be outdone, began its own performance moments later. Its shell split in a pattern that looked exactly like the constellation Gemini, which several astronomers later insisted was a bit too on the nose, even for divine symbolism. Thunder provided a suitably dramatic soundtrack, while outside, clouds arranged themselves into what looked suspiciously like a heavenly audience. Several palace peacocks, sensing they were about to be upstaged in the beautiful offspring department, sulked in the garden and refused to acknowledge the proceedings. The actual emergence of the children was less of a birth and more of a choreographed entrance into existence. From the first egg emerged Castor and Pollux, already displaying the sort of coordinated timing that would later make them legendary. They didn't so much hatch as debut, arriving with tiny golden curls and expressions that suggested they were already planning adventures. From the second egg came Helen and Clytemnestra, managing somehow to look both regal and adorable, while emerging from a divine eggshell. Helen, even as a newborn, possessed the kind of beauty that made the attending midwives forget what they were doing and start composing poetry. Several nearby flowers spontaneously bloomed, then immediately wilted in acknowledgement of their inadequacy. The babies remarkably did not cry. Instead, they produced what witnesses described as a harmony that made nightingales sound like amateurs. The room filled with a gentle golden light, and for a brief moment everyone present swore they could hear distant lyres playing. The empty eggshells, rather than simply lying there like ordinary birth debris, dissolved into stardust that floated upward and formed brief, congratulatory messages in ancient Greek before dissipating. The more practical-minded servants try to sweep it up, only to find that divine eggshell residue refuses to be cleaned by mortal means. King Tyndareus, who had been pacing nervously in the adjoining chamber, was finally allowed in to meet his extremely unusual new family members. Historical records suggest he handled the situation with remarkable grace, though several sources mention he might have needed a moment to sit down when he noticed that the twins occasionally levitated during their naps, and so began one of mythology's more complicated family situations. The palace nursery quickly became a study in supernatural childcare challenges. The nurses discovered that divine adjacent infants have their own unique requirements: golden cradles that adjusted to the phases of the moon, lullabies that had to be sung in perfect ancient Greek, and swaddling clothes woven from dawn light and summer breezes. Zeus, in typical godly father fashion, marked the occasion by sending gifts: tiny thunderbolts, immediately confiscated by the sensible nursemaids, miniature golden armour, stored away for later, and a mobile made of actual stars, which had an unfortunate tendency to rearrange itself according to astronomical events. The children grew, as children do, though perhaps not quite like other children. Castor and Pollux showed early signs of heroic destiny, taking turns arm-wrestling minor monsters that somehow found their way into the nursery. Helen's beauty increased daily, causing several diplomatic incidents before she could even walk. Clytemnestra displayed a remarkable talent for strategy, regularly organising the palace toys into complex military formations. And Leda? She adapted to motherhood with the same grace she'd shown in handling divine waterfowl visitations, though she did occasionally give Thunderstorm somewhat knowing looks, and was heard to mutter about dramatic entrances whenever swans flew overhead. The tale of Leda and the Swan became one of those stories that parents tell their children with significant editing, that poets approach with careful metaphors, and that artists spend centuries trying to depict without being too obvious about it. It joined the great tapestry of Greek mythology, another thread in the complex weave of divine intervention in mortal affairs. And somewhere in Sparta, in a carefully preserved chest, 2 small pieces of divine eggshell still sparkle with starlight, refusing to tarnish or fade. Because some memories, like some stories, are meant to keep their shine forever. As for the swan, well, Zeus went on to have other adventures, though palace gossip suggested he became notably more self-conscious about his transformation choices afterward. Several other gods were heard to make pointed comments about just using the front door next time, but such suggestions were generally met with divine grumbling and strategic thunderclaps. And so our tale ends, as all good tales should, with a moral. Sometimes the most extraordinary stories begin with the most unlikely encounters. Also perhaps that one should always be kind to injured wildlife,